Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Texas Podcast. I am your host, Gabe, and today we'll be talking about the Battle of Palmito Ranch. The Battle of Palmito Ranch, also known as the Battle of Palmito Hill, is considered by some criteria as the final battle of the American Civil War. It was fought on May 12th and the 13th of 1865 on the banks of the Rio Grande, east of Brownsville, Texas, and a few miles from the seaport of Los Brazos de Santiago at the southern tip of Texas. The battle took place more than a month after the general surrender of Confederate forces to Union forces at Appomattox Courthouse, which had since been communicated by both commanders at Palmito, and in the intervening weeks the Confederacy had collapsed entirely, so it could also be classified as a post-war action. Union and Confederate forces in southern Texas had been observing an unofficial truce since the beginning of 1865, but Union Colonel Theodore H. Barrett, newly assigned to command an all-black unit and never having been involved in combat, ordered an attack on a Confederate camp near Fort Brown for unknown reasons. The Union attackers captured a few prisoners, but the following day the attack was repulsed near Palmito Ranch by Colonel John Salmon Ford, and the battle resulted in a Confederate victory. Union forces were surprised by artillery said to have been supplied by the French Army garrison occupying the upriver Mexican town of Matamoros. Casualty estimates are not dependable, but Union Private John J. Williams on the 34th Indiana Infantry Regiment is believed to have been the last man killed during the engagement. He could then arguably be reckoned as the last man killed in the American Civil War. After July 27, 1864, the Union Army withdrew most of the 6,500 troops deployed to the lower Rio Grande Valley, including Brownsville, which they had occupied since November 2, 1863. The Confederates were determined to protect their remaining ports, which were essential for cotton sales to Europe and the importation of supplies. The Mexicans across the border tended to side with the Confederates because of the lucrative cotton export trade. Beginning in the early 1865, the rival armies in South Texas honored a gentleman's agreement as they saw no point in further hostilities between them. Union Major General Lew Wallace proposed a negotiated end of hostilities in Texas to Confederate Brigadier General James E. Slaughter, and met with Slaughter and his subordinate Colonel Ford at Port Isabel on March 11 through the 12th, 1865. Despite Slaughter's and Ford's agreements that combat would prove tragic, Slaughter's superior, Confederate Major General John G. Walker, rejected the ceasefire and a scathing exchange of letters with Wallace. Despite this, both sides honored a tacit agreement not to advance on the other without prior written notice. A brigade of 1,900 Union troops commanded by Colonel Robert B. Jones of the 34th Indiana Veteran Volunteer Infantry were on blockade duty at the port of the Brazos Santiago at the mouth of the present-day ship channel of the port of Brownsville. The 400-man 34th Indiana was an experienced regiment that had served in the Vicksburg campaign and was reorganized in December 1863 as a veteran regiment, composed entirely of veterans from several other regiments whose originally enlistments had expired. The 34th Indiana deployed to Los Brazos de Santiago on December 22, 1864, replacing the 91st Illinois Volunteer Infantry, which returned to New Orleans. The brigade also included the 87th and 62nd United States Colored Infantry Regiments, known as the United States Colored Troops or the USCT, which had combined strength of about 1,100. Shortly after General Walker rejected the armistice proposal, Colonel Jones resigned from the Army to return to Indiana. He was replaced in the regiment by Lieutenant Colonel Robert G. Morrison and at Los Brazos de Santiago by Colonel Theodore H. Barrett, commander of the 72nd USCT. The 30-year-old Barrett had been an Army officer since 1862, but he had yet to see combat. Anxious for higher rank, he volunteered for the newly raised colored regiments and was appointed in 1863 as colonel of the 1st Missouri Colored Infantry. In March 1864, the regiment became the 62nd USCT. Barrett contracted malaria in Louisiana that summer, and while he was on convalescent leave, the 62nd was posted to Brazos Santiago. He joined it there in February 1865. Historians still debate why this engagement at Palmito Ranch took place. Lee had surrendered to Grant in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia on April 9th, triggering a series of formal surrenders in other places throughout the country. The Confederate and Union officers in Brownsville also knew that Lee had surrendered, effectively ending the war. Soon after the battle, Barrett's detractors claimed he desired a little battlefield glory before the war ended altogether. Others have suggested that Barrett needed horses for the 300 unmounted cavalrymen in his brigade and decided to take them from his enemy. Lewis J. Schuler, in his 1960 pamphlet, The Last Battle in the War Between the States, May 13, 1865, Confederate force of 300 defeats 1,700 Federals near Brownsville, Texas, asserts that Brigadier General Egbert B. Brown of the U.S. Volunteers had ordered the expedition to seize as contraband 2,000 bales of cotton stored in Brownsville and sell them for his own profit. But Brown was not even appointed to command at Brazos Santiago until later in May. According to historian Jerry Thompson, what was at stake was honor and money. With a stubborn reluctance to admit defeat, Ford asserted that the dignity and manhood of his men had to be defended. Having previously proclaimed that he would never capitulate to a mongrel force of abolitionist Negroes plundering Mexicans and perfidious renegades, Ford was not about to surrender to invading black troops. Even more important was the large quantity of Richard King and Mifflin Kennedy's cotton stacked in Brownsville, waiting to be sent across the river to Matamoros. If Ford did not hold off the invading Federal force, the cotton would be confiscated by the Yankees and thousands of dollars would be lost. Union Lieutenant Colonel David Branson wanted to attack the Confederate encampments commanded by Ford at White and Palmito ranches near Fort Brown outside Brownsville. Branson's unit, Union forces, consisted of 250 men of the 62nd USCT and 8 companies and 2 companies of the U.S. 2nd Texas Cavalry Battalion. The 300-man 2nd Texas, like the earlier formed 1st Texas Cavalry Regiment, and was composed largely of Texans of Mexican origin who remained loyal to the United States. They moved from Brazos Santiago to the mainland. At first, Branson's expedition was successful, capturing 3 prisoners and some supplies, although it failed to achieve the desired surprise. During the afternoon, Confederate forces under Captain William N. Robinson counterattacked with less than 100 cavalry, driving Branson back to White's Ranch, where the fighting stopped for the night. Both sides sent for reinforcements. Ford arrived with 6 French guns and the remainder of his cavalry force for a total of 300 men, while Barrett came with 200 troops of the 34th Indiana and 9 understrength companies. The next day, Barrett started advancing westward, passing a half-mile to the west of Palmito Ranch, with skirmishers from the 34th Indiana deployed in advance. Ford attacked Barrett's force as it was skirmishing with an advanced Confederate force along the Rio Grande about 4 p.m. He sent a couple of companies with artillery to attack the Union right flank and the remainder of his force into a frontal attack. After some confusion and fierce fighting, the Union forces retreated towards Boca Chica. Barrett attempted to form a rear guard, but Confederate artillery prevented him from rallying a force sufficient to do so. During the retreat, which lasted until the 14th of May, 50 members of the 34th Indiana Rear Guard Company, 30 stragglers, and 20 of the dismounted cavalry were surrounded in a bend of the Rio Grande and captured. The battle was recorded as a Confederate victory. Fighting in the battle involved Caucasian, African American, Hispanic, and Native American troops. Reports of shots from the Mexican side, the sounding of a warning to the Confederates of the Union approaching, the crossing of Imperial cavalry into Texas, and the participation by several among Ford's troops are unverified, despite many witnesses reporting shooting from the Mexican shore. In Barrett's official report of August 10, 1865, he reported 115 Union casualties, 1 killed and 9 wounded and 105 captured. Confederate casualties were reported as 5 or 6 wounded with none killed. Historian and Ford biographer Stephen B. Oates, however, concludes that Union deaths were much higher, probably around 30, many of whom drowned in the Rio Grande or were attacked by French border guards on the Mexican side. He likewise estimated Confederate casualties at approximately the same number. Using court-martial testimony and post-returns from Brazos Santiago, historian Jerry D. Thompson of Texas A&M International University determined that the 62nd USCT incurred 2 killed and 4 wounded. The 34th Indiana had 1 killed and 1 wounded and 79 captured, and the 2nd Texas Cavalry Battalion had 1 killed, 7 wounded, and 22 captured, totaling 4 killed, 12 wounded, and 101 captured. Private John J. Williams of the 34th Indiana was the last fatality during the Battle of Palmito Ranch, likely making him the final combat death of the entire war. President Jefferson Davis was captured and imprisoned on May 10, 1865, marking the effective end of the Confederate government. In addition, that day, United States President Andrew Johnson declared armed resistance virtually at an end. Historian James McPherson joins other historians in concluding that the war ended when the government ended. Confederate General Edmund Kirby Smith officially surrendered all Confederate forces in the Trans-Mississippi Department on June 2, 1865, except those under the command of Brigadier General Chief Stan Wadey in the Indian Territory. Stan Wadey of the 1st Cherokee Mounted Rifles on June 23, 1865, became the last Confederate general to surrender his forces in Dokesville, Indian Territory. On the same day, United States President Andrew Johnson ended the Union blockade of the southern states. Many senior Confederate commanders in Texas, including Smith, Walker, Slaughter, and Ford, and many troops with their equipment fled across the border to Mexico. Wanting to resist capture, they may have also intended to ally with French imperial forces or with Mexican forces under deposed President Benito Juarez. The Mexican Division of the Southwest, commanded by Major General Philip H. Sheridan, occupied Texas between June and August, consisting of the 4th Corps, the 7th Corps, and the African-American 25th Corps, in two 4,000-man cavalry divisions commanded by Brigadier General Wesley Merritt and Major General George A. Custer. It integrated a 50,000-man force on the Gulf Coast and along the Rio Grande to pressure the French intervention in Mexico and garrison the Reconstruction Department of Texas. In July 1865, Barrett preferred charges of disobedience of orders, neglect of duty, abandoning his colors, and conduct prejudicial to good order and military discipline against Morrison for actions in the battle, resulting in the latter's court-martial. Confederate Colonel Ford, who had returned from Mexico at the request of Union General Frederick Steele to act as parole commissioner for disbanding Confederate forces, appeared as a defense witness and assisted in absolving Morrison of responsibility for the defeat at Palmito Ranch. The history of this engagement provides accounts of the roles of Hispanic Confederate veterans and of treatment by Confederates in South Texas of black prisoners of war. Hispanic Confederates served at Fort Brown in Brownsville and on the field of Palmito Ranch. Colonel Santos Benavides, who was one of the highest-ranking Hispanics in either army, led between 100 and 150 Hispanic soldiers in the Brownsville campaign in May 1865. Some of the 62nd Colored Regiment were also taken in the Battle of Palmito Ranch. They had been led to believe that if captured, they would either be shot or returned to slavery. They were arguably surprised when they were paroled and permitted to depart with the white prisoners, several of the prisoners from Austin and vicinity. They were assured they would be treated as prisoners of war. There was no disposition to visit upon them a mean spirit of revenge. When Colonel Ford surrendered his command following the campaign of Palmito Ranch, he urged his men to honor their paroles. He insisted that the Negro had a right to vote. Although officially most historians say that this was the last land action fought between the North and the South, some sources suggest that the battle on May 19, 1865 of Hobbs Ridge, located near Eufaula, Alabama, was the last skirmish between the two forces. Union records show that the last Northern soldier killed in combat during the war was Corporal John W. Skinner in this action. 3 others were wounded, also from the same unit, Company C, 1st Florida U.S. Cavalry. Historian Richard Gardner stated in 2013 that on May 10, 1865, a confrontation took place at Palmetto Ranch. There was no Confederacy in existence when the battle occurred. The ex-Confederates at Palmetto Ranch were aware that Lee had surrendered and that the war was over. What happened in Texas can only be understood as a post-war encounter between Federals and ex-Confederate outlaws. The Confederates won this engagement, but as there was no organized command structure, there has been controversy about the Union casualties. In 1896, these same men had their pensions cut, although this was quickly rectified by an appeal by the Commissioner of Pensions. The Assistant Secretary of the Commissioner overturned the pension cut, legally ruling the men as the last Union casualties of the war. On April 2, 1866, President Johnson declared the insurrection at an end, except in Texas. There, a technicality concerning incomplete formation of a new state government prevented declaring the insurrection over. Johnson declared the insurrection at an end in Texas and throughout the United States on August 20, 1866. The area has remained relatively unchanged, with the marshy, windswept prairies almost the same as they were in 1865. The site is more than 5,400 acres in size and was designated as a National Historic Landmark in 1997. The area is indicated by a large highway marker telling the history of the engagement, installed on the Boca Chica Highway near Palmito Ranch originally stood. The Civil War Trust and its partners have acquired and preserved 3 acres of the battlefield. That is all for the Battle of Palmito Ranch. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see y'all